The countryside had a way of holding silence as if it were a secret. The wind brushed across the rolling fields, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and wood smoke. Margaret watched from the kitchen window, her thin fingers curled around a porcelain cup of tea. She had lived in this house for almost 30 years, long enough to know the rhythm of the seasons, the creak of each floorboard, the way the late October sun leaned lazily through the windows. She was 70 now, though she hardly felt it, at least not in spirit. Her reflection sometimes startled her. Silver hair pulled neatly into a twist, soft lines tracing stories across her face, eyes still clear and bright, though perhaps lonelier than she liked to admit. That loneliness had grown quieter after her daughter, Emily, married. Quieter but not gone. Now, Emily was away on a research project in Scotland, and Daniel, her husband, had come to stay for a few weeks to keep an eye on things. Margaret hadn't objected, though the arrangement had surprised her. Daniel had always been kind, thoughtful, even shy around her. He was 30, handsome in a way that didn't draw attention to itself. Dark hair, easy smile, steady hands. When he arrived, the rain was just beginning. She heard the car in the gravel drive and went to the door, her shawl drawn close. "Daniel," she greeted, warmth slipping into her voice despite herself. "You must be soaked." He smiled, his jacket dark with rain. "Only a little. It's good to see you, Margaret." It had been months since they'd last met, but something in his tone made the space between them feel smaller. Inside, he carried his suitcase up to the guest room, the one overlooking the garden. The house had an old, comforting smell, wood, lavender, and thyme. They settled into a quiet rhythm over the next few days. Margaret rose early, made tea, read by the fire. Daniel worked remotely from his laptop, sometimes in the conservatory, sometimes at the kitchen table. Their conversations were light. The weather, the garden, the news. But beneath it all, there was a soft awareness, a shared stillness that neither of them tried to name. One morning, Margaret found him outside, repairing a section of the fence that had blown down. The air was crisp, her breath visible. She watched him from the path for a moment before speaking. "You didn't have to do that," she said gently. He looked up, smiling. "I like to keep busy. Besides, I can't let your garden suffer." There was humor in his voice, but something else too. Care, quiet and unspoken. She joined him, handing him a mug of tea she'd brought out. Their fingers brushed for a second, and the contact sent an unexpected warmth through her. She drew her hand back quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed. He had. But he said nothing. Later that day, as rain began again, they found themselves sitting by the fire. Margaret was knitting. Daniel was reading. The soft patter of rain against the windows filled the spaces between them. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. She paused, the knitting needles still in her hands. "Sometimes. It's peaceful, but, yes, the silence can be very loud." He nodded slowly. "I think I understand that." They shared a small, knowing smile, one that lingered longer than it should have. As days passed, Daniel began to notice things he hadn't before. The graceful way she moved through the house, the calm intelligence in her voice, the kindness that lived in her gestures. Margaret noticed things too. The depth of his eyes, the steadiness of his presence, how the house seemed less empty when he was in it. One evening the power went out. A storm had rolled through, and the house was wrapped in darkness. Margaret lit candles, their glow flickering across her features. Daniel joined her in the living room, carrying a lantern. "It's like the old days," she said, smiling softly. He chuckled. "Before Wi-Fi and electricity. You probably remember it better than I do." She laughed quietly, shaking her head. "Careful, Daniel. You'll make me sound ancient." "You're not," he said too quickly. The word hung between them. Margaret looked at him, really looked, and saw that he meant it. The warmth in his gaze was disarming, almost tender. For a heartbeat neither spoke. The moment passed, gentle but undeniable. She turned away, pretending to adjust a candle. "We should make sure the windows are closed," she murmured. That night, Neither of them slept easily. Margaret lay awake, the storm whispering against the glass, her mind wandering where it shouldn't. She thought of Daniel's voice, the kindness in his eyes, and felt a strange ache, part guilt, part longing, part something she couldn't name. Down the hall, Daniel lay awake too, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't sure what was happening between them, if anything truly was. But he couldn't ignore the pull, the quiet magnetism that had settled between their words and silences. The next morning dawned pale and cold. Margaret made breakfast, and Daniel joined her, looking a little tired but smiling nonetheless. "Did you sleep?" she asked. "Not much," he admitted. "The storm kept me up." "Me too." Their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed again, an awareness that both of them were thinking of the same storm, though not for the same reason. Outside, the world glistened with rain. The fields were wet, the sky low and silver. Margaret poured tea, and Daniel took his cup carefully, their hands close but not touching. Life in the house went on as before, but with every passing day, the quiet grew heavier, charged with something neither of them dared to speak aloud. The week that followed was washed in pale autumn light. The fields surrounding the house turned a deeper shade of gold, the trees half bare and whispering in the wind. Margaret found herself moving more slowly through her days, but not from age. It was Daniel's presence, quiet, steady, that had changed the rhythm of the house. He worked from the conservatory most mornings, his laptop open, the sound of his typing filling the silence. Margaret had grown used to that sound. It was strange how quickly small things became familiar. The sight of him by the window, the way he always made a second cup of tea for her without asking, the faint hum of music from his phone when he thought she wasn't listening. One afternoon, she brought him a plate of scones fresh from the oven. "You're spoiling me," he said, smiling as she set them down beside him. "Someone has to," she replied a little too softly. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither looked away. There was nothing improper in it, only warmth, unguarded and real. But it made something flutter quietly inside her chest. Later that day, the two of them took a walk down the path that led to the orchard. The sky hung low and gray, and a chill lingered in the air. Margaret wrapped her scarf tighter, while Daniel matched his pace to hers. "I can't remember the last time I took a proper walk," she admitted. "Emily always rushed me along when she was younger." He laughed gently. "She's her mother's daughter." "I can imagine." Margaret raised a brow. "And what does that mean?" "That you both know exactly what you want," he said with an easy grin. The answer made her laugh, really laugh, a sound that startled her with its youthfulness. Daniel's gaze softened at the sound, though he quickly looked away. They reached the old bench by the orchard wall. The wood was damp, so he took off his jacket and spread it across the seat before she could protest. "You'll freeze," she said. "I'll survive." She hesitated, then sat. The wind stirred the branches above them, sending a few leaves tumbling to the ground. For a while, they sat without speaking, listening to the rustle of the orchard. Margaret broke the silence first. "You miss her, don't you?" "Emily." He drew a breath. "I do. But not in the way you might think." She turned to him. His expression was thoughtful, a touch of sadness beneath it. "She's wonderful," he continued. "But she's always been focused on her work. I knew that when we married. I admire her for it. But sometimes—" He stopped himself, as if catching a thought he shouldn't share. Margaret waited, her gaze steady. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living around her life, not inside it," he finished quietly. The honesty of it pierced her. She understood more than she wanted to admit. "Daniel," she said softly, "you're a good man. Don't let the world make you feel small for needing to be seen." Her words seemed to reach him. He looked at her, and the silence that followed was not awkward but full of meaning, an understanding that went beyond words. When they returned to the house, the lamps were already glowing. Daniel started the fire, and Margaret set out dinner. It felt strangely domestic, the two of them moving around each other with quiet ease. Later, as the evening deepened, Margaret found him by the piano in the sitting room. She hadn't touched it in years. He was tracing a finger along the keys, almost reverently. "Do you play?" she asked from the doorway. "A little," he said. "I used to. My mother made me take lessons." "Play something then." He hesitated. "Only if you promise not to laugh." "I never laugh at bravery," she said with a small smile. He sat and began to play. The melody was simple, something soft and old, a tune that carried memory in every note. Margaret stood listening, her eyes glistening in the candlelight. It was as if the years between them melted for a moment, leaving only the quiet language of music. When the last note faded, she whispered, "That was beautiful." He looked up at her. "It's strange," he said quietly. "I haven't played in years, but it feels right here." Her heart tightened. "Yes," she said, barely above a whisper. "It does." The days slipped by like that, slow, tender, full of unspoken understanding. They cooked together, shared stories over tea, and sometimes sat in silence that said more than words could. But there were moments, fleeting, fragile, when the boundary between comfort and longing blurred. One morning, as she reached for a jar on a high shelf, Daniel stepped close behind her to help. His hand brushed hers as he took it down, and for an instant, the air felt charged. Neither spoke. The closeness lasted only a second, but it lingered in both their minds long after. That evening, Margaret sat by the fire, a book open on her lap though she hadn't turned a page in an hour. Daniel entered quietly, setting a cup of tea beside her. "You always know what I need," she said. He smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm just learning to listen." She looked up at him then, her eyes meeting his, warm, searching, uncertain. "Daniel," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "you've been very kind to me. More than I deserve." He shook his head. "You deserve more kindness than you've been given." Her breath caught. There was no mistaking the sincerity in his tone. She wanted to say something, to remind him of what they were, of the lines that couldn't be crossed, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she smiled faintly and said, "You're a good man, Daniel." He turned away, as if afraid his expression might betray too much. "I'll take that as a compliment," he said lightly. When he left the room, Margaret closed her eyes. The sound of his footsteps faded down the hall, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She knew what was happening, and she also knew it couldn't be. Yet, in the quiet of that old house, the heart often refused to obey reason. As the fire crackled low, she reached for her cup, her hand trembling slightly. Somewhere in the distance, she heard Daniel's faint laugh from another room, and despite herself she smiled. For the first time in years she felt truly seen. And that frightened her more than she could admit. The days grew shorter, the sky shifting from pale gray to a soft muted blue that barely warmed the late autumn afternoons. Margaret found herself moving through the house with a lighter step, though she could not explain why. Daniel's presence had become a subtle pulse in her daily life, a quiet rhythm she had not expected but had come to rely upon. He lingered longer at breakfast now, his conversation threading seamlessly with hers. They spoke of trivialities, the angle of the sun in the garden, a book one had recently read, but beneath the surface, the words carried a weight neither of them admitted aloud. One afternoon, as the wind howled outside and leaves swirled around the stone steps, Margaret caught Daniel staring at her across the sitting room. He quickly looked away when she met his gaze, pretending to be engrossed in the pages of a novel. She noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers brushed the edge of the table, lingering just a fraction too long. The awareness of him made her pulse quicken. She told herself it was absurd. She was 70, he was 30, and yet, here they were, drawn together in ways neither dared articulate. That evening, Margaret decided to take a walk through the orchard again. The air was sharp and fragrant, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Daniel joined her, quietly, as though sensing her need for solitude, but unwilling to be apart. They walked side by side, leaves crunching underfoot, and for the first time, neither spoke immediately. The silence was not empty, It was filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of what lingered between them. "I think I've grown accustomed to your presence," Margaret said softly after a while, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. Daniel's lips twitched into a smile. "I hope that's a good thing." "It is," she replied, her voice barely above the rustling of the leaves. "It's comforting. More than I expected." He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time in years. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I feel different here. Easier. Like I can just be myself." Her heart caught. She wanted to tell him that she felt the same, that these past weeks had shifted something inside her, something that made her feel alive again. But caution held her tongue. Instead, she nodded, a small, fragile gesture that carried more than words ever could. Back in the house, the evening stretched lazily. Margaret sat by the fire, knitting absent-mindedly, while Daniel worked on a small writing project at the table nearby. Occasionally, their eyes met, lingering a second too long before darting away. At one point, Margaret reached for a shawl that had slipped to the floor, and Daniel was there, picking it up for her. Their fingers brushed lightly. The brief contact sparked an electric current that neither acknowledged, but both felt deeply. Later, they shared tea in the dim light of the kitchen. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, but inside, the house felt cocooned, safe, intimate. "You know," Daniel began, stirring his cup absent-mindedly, "I never realized how quiet life could be, and how much that quiet could speak." Margaret looked up at him, sensing the weight behind his words. "Yes," she murmured. "Silence is sometimes more honest than conversation." They sat for a while, the words settling between them like dust motes in the firelight. Each was aware of the invisible thread connecting them, a mix of trust, admiration, and something more fragile, more dangerous. The days continued, small gestures piling upon one another. Daniel would leave a notebook where he knew Margaret would find it, filled with sketches of the garden and the orchard. Margaret would notice the way he adjusted the curtains so that the afternoon sun fell just right across the sitting room. These were quiet acts of care, unspoken and deliberate, a dance of attention neither wanted to name. One rainy afternoon, Margaret found herself cleaning the windows in the conservatory. Daniel appeared behind her, holding a cloth. "May I?" he asked softly. She stepped aside, and together they worked, brushing the glass until it gleamed. Their hands passed each other more than once, lingered, then drew back. Each touch was a question unanswered, a secret neither dared to voice. As the storm outside raged, they paused, looking at each other through the clear panes. Margaret felt a swell of emotion she could not define. Warmth, tenderness, a longing she had thought long buried. "Daniel," she whispered, but the sound barely left her lips. "I know," he said, his voice equally low, understanding. They didn't need to say more. Their eyes held the conversation, speaking of awareness, desire, and restraint all at once. Later that night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about the day, about Daniel's presence, the way he had been near her, yet careful. She felt alive, yes, but also acutely aware of the boundaries she could not cross. The tension between them was a living thing, delicate and relentless, a test of patience and heart. Down the hall, Daniel lay awake. He thought of Margaret's hands, her smile, the warmth of her gaze. He knew he should stop, should give space, should think only of Emily. But the pull toward her was something he couldn't easily name, something gentle yet insistent. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, their dreams were filled with moments too fleeting to remember clearly, yet vivid enough to linger in the morning light. The following day brought more quiet closeness. They shared a walk along the garden, lingering over the roses and the bare branches of the winter-bound trees. Every glance, every brush of fingers as they handed tools or cups of tea, carried unspoken meaning. By now, both Margaret and Daniel were aware that their connection had shifted, though neither had voiced it. The house was filled with subtle tension, a delicate charge that made ordinary moments extraordinary. A glance across the table, a smile, a pause in conversation, all of it carried weight, significance, possibility. Neither could deny it any longer. What began as quiet companionship was evolving into something more profound, more intimate. And yet, the wisdom of age and the responsibility of circumstance held them in check. Each step forward was measured, cautious, and yet brimming with emotion. As the autumn sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden haze over the fields, Margaret stood by the window, feeling Daniel's eyes on her from across the room. She didn't turn to look. She didn't have to. The unspoken truth hovered between them, delicate and persistent. And in that quiet, in that soft twilight, they both understood. They had crossed into a new chapter of feeling, one full of risk and warmth, longing and restraint, and neither was quite ready to turn back. Winter had begun to settle over the countryside, the fields now muted under a light frost, and the house itself seemed to huddle in the soft grey light of the mornings. Margaret moved through her days with a quiet energy, a subtle brightness in her eyes that Daniel noticed immediately, though he never commented aloud. It was a Sunday morning, the kind where the sky was a pale sheet over the earth, and the wind whispered through the trees with a gentle insistence. Margaret prepared breakfast in the kitchen, her movements methodical, almost ceremonial, as Daniel wandered in carrying a small bundle of firewood. "Let me help," she said, though he only smiled and placed it down beside the hearth. "You already do so much," he replied softly. "Let me do this." There was something tender in the simplicity of the gesture, a reminder that intimacy could exist without words, without declarations. Margaret caught herself studying him, how the light caught his hair, the subtle way his fingers lingered on the wood, the quiet attention in his eyes when they met hers. She felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. After breakfast, they settled in the sitting room. The fire crackled low, the room filled with soft shadows that danced across the walls. Daniel was sketching the garden from memory in a notebook, his pencil tracing delicate lines. Margaret watched him for a long moment, noting how focused he was, how alive he seemed in this quiet world of observation and care. "You always notice things," she said quietly, not intending to break the silence, but the words slipped out. He looked up surprised and then smiled. "I notice you," he said simply. The words hung in the air, neither forceful nor heavy, yet imbued with meaning. Margaret felt her chest tighten, not with alarm but with recognition. The house was quiet, yet in that quiet, their connection had never felt louder. Later, they walked through the orchard once again, frost glinting on the branches like scattered diamonds. The air was sharp, invigorating, and Margaret found herself speaking more freely than she had in weeks. "Daniel, I've lived here a long time," she said, her voice catching slightly. "I've seen the seasons change, the years pass, and yet," she paused, searching for the right words, "I haven't felt this awareness of life, of being alive, in a long while." He stopped, turning to face her, and the frost dusted his hair. "I feel the same," he admitted, the honesty in his voice gentle and raw. "It's strange. I don't know how it happened, but I feel at home here with you." Margaret's eyes softened. She reached out instinctively, brushing a leaf from his shoulder, an action so small yet so laden with meaning. Daniel didn't flinch. He let her hand linger for a moment, then returned it to himself, careful but unresisting. They continued walking, speaking of trivial things, plans for the garden, the angle of the sun, but beneath the conversation, a silent acknowledgement flowed, wrapping around them like the crisp winter air. By the evening, they returned to the warmth of the house. Margaret poured tea, and Daniel brought over a tray of cookies he had baked earlier. They shared the treats quietly, comfortable in the presence of one another. Afterwards, Margaret found herself by the fire, the glow warming her face. Daniel joined her, settling into the armchair opposite hers. The firelight danced across their features, illuminating the subtle expressions that had become so familiar to each of them. "You know," Daniel said softly, "I've never felt this seen. Not in years. Not like this." Margaret's heart ached, a sweet, tender ache. "Nor I," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "It's unexpected, but I feel it too." They sat in silence for some time, the quiet full of meaning, the kind of intimacy that requires no words. Margaret looked into the fire, feeling the heat and warmth in a way that mirrored the connection she shared with Daniel. She thought of all the moments, the small gestures, the glances, the touches brushed aside as accidental, and realized how deeply they had woven themselves into her life. At that moment, the front door opened, letting in the cold wind briefly. Margaret and Daniel both looked up, and for a fleeting instant, reality returned. The outside world, obligations, the inevitable boundaries of life. But the warmth of the room, the fire, the tea, and the quiet understanding between them held firm. Daniel rose to adjust the curtains, and Margaret found herself watching the movement, noting the grace and care in his actions. For a moment, their eyes met across the room, and in that gaze, an entire conversation passed without a word. It spoke of respect, of admiration, of longing held in check. Later, Margaret sat in her favorite chair, knitting once more, but she was aware of Daniel moving around the room, tidying, adjusting, attending. Every gesture felt like an unspoken promise, a testament to the bond that had grown between them. "Margaret," he said suddenly, stopping near her, "thank you for letting me be here. For letting me feel part of this life, part of your world." She looked up at him, warmth pooling in her chest. "You've brought life back into this house," she whispered. "And into my days. I never expected this, but I am grateful." Their eyes met, soft and unguarded. There was a fragile intensity there. Not desire in the way the world often demands it, but a deep, abiding care that had grown over time, nurtured in silence, glances, shared stories, and simple, thoughtful gestures. Daniel reached out slowly, placing his hand over hers. The contact was gentle, reassuring, and entirely respectful, yet it spoke volumes. Margaret didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed herself to feel the connection fully, letting it settle into the quiet of her heart. "I feel it too," she said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of unspoken emotions. They remained like that for a long while, hands touching lightly, eyes locked in understanding. Outside, the frost glimmered and the night deepened, but inside, the warmth of the fire and their shared presence created a sanctuary. There was no need for more. No need for declarations, for reckless abandon, or for anything beyond what they had found. A rare, tender intimacy born of respect, understanding, and mutual recognition. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet rituals, laughter, shared cups of tea, and long, contemplative walks. The house seemed to hum with life again, a life infused with emotional closeness, trust, and a gentle, enduring connection. Margaret and Daniel had discovered something extraordinary. Not fleeting passion, but a slow, steady bloom of the heart. It was the kind of bond that did not require overt gestures, the kind that thrived in glances, touches, and words carefully chosen. And as winter settled fully, snow beginning to dust the gardens, they shared the knowledge that what they had found, this rare, beautiful understanding, was enough. It was profound, unspoken, and utterly theirs. The house stood quiet around them, filled with warmth, trust, and the gentle pulse of hearts finally seen. And in that quiet, Margaret and Daniel understood that love and connection could take many forms, sometimes unexpected, sometimes forbidden by age or convention, yet still real, deep, and enduring. For the first time in a long time, both felt wholly alive.